The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince William walked slowly through the familiar corridors. His footsteps echoed against the ancient stone walls, each step heavier than the last. Kate followed closely. Behind him, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm in a gesture of silent support. They had received the call just an hour ago, and neither of them had spoken much since. The message had been brief but devastating. The Children's Hospital in London had requested their immediate presence. Something had happened during the night, something that required their attention as patrons of the hospital. The voice on the other end of the phone had been careful with words, but William could hear the urgency beneath the professional tone. As they made their way to the waiting car, Kate glanced at her husband's face. She had seen him handle countless difficult situations throughout their years together. But today something was different. His jaw was set in that particular way that told her he was fighting to maintain control. His blue eyes, usually so warm and reassuring, held a depth of concern that made her stomach tighten with worry. The drive to London felt longer than usual. William stared out the window at the passing countryside, his mind racing through possibilities. As a father himself, visits to children's hospitals were always emotional, but they were also filled with hope and joy. The children's faces would light up when they arrived, and despite their illnesses, there was always laughter and smiles. Today felt different before they had even arrived. Kate reached across the seat and took his hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warm autumn day. She had learned to read the subtle changes in William's demeanor over their years of marriage, and she could sense his inner turmoil. Whatever awaited them at the hospital, they would face it together, as they always did. The hospital director, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, met them at the private entrance. Her usual bright smile was replaced with a somber expression that immediately confirmed their fears. She led them through the quiet hallways, past the colorful murals and cheerful decorations that usually brought such life to the pediatric wing. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Mitchell began carefully, "I want to prepare you for what you're about to see. Last night, we had an emergency situation that affected several of our young patients. The medical team worked tirelessly through the night, but—" She paused, struggling to find the right words. William stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "What happened, Sarah?" Dr. Mitchell took a deep breath. "There was a fire in the residential building next to the hospital. Several families who were staying there while their children received treatment were affected. We've had to set up emergency accommodation here in the hospital, and the children, they've been through something no child should ever experience." Kate felt her breath catch in her throat. The families who stayed in those residential buildings were often there for weeks or months while their children underwent complex treatments. These were families already dealing with unimaginable stress, and now they had faced another traumatic event. As they approached the main ward, the usual sounds of children playing and laughing were noticeably absent. Instead, there was a heavy silence that seemed to weigh down the entire floor. Through the glass doors, they could see medical staff moving quietly between rooms, their faces grave and focused. Dr. Mitchell led them to a large room that had been converted into a temporary gathering area. "We've brought some of the families here," she explained softly. "Many of them lost everything in the fire, their belongings, their temporary homes, their sense of security. The children are struggling to understand what happened." William and Kate exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They had visited this hospital many times over the years, had met hundreds of brave children and their families. These people had become like an extended family to them, and seeing them in distress was almost unbearable. Through the window, they could see a group of children huddled together on makeshift beds. Some were clinging to stuffed animals that looked singed and dirty. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing in particular. Parents sat beside their children, looking lost and overwhelmed. The sight was heartbreaking in its quiet desperation. One little girl, no more than 6 years old, was sitting alone on a bed near the window. Her dark hair was tangled, and she wore clothes that were clearly too big for her small frame. In her arms, she clutched a severely damaged teddy bear, its fur blackened and one eye missing. She rocked back and forth slowly, whispering something to the damaged toy. Kate's eyes immediately filled with tears as she watched the child. The little girl reminded her so much of Charlotte, and she could imagine how terrifying the night must have been for someone so young. The thought of her own children facing such fear and confusion made her heart ache. William placed his hand on Kate's shoulder, offering her strength while drawing some from her presence. They had seen many difficult situations in their royal duties, but nothing quite like this. The combination of serious illness and sudden trauma created a perfect storm of human suffering that was almost too much to bear. Dr. Mitchell continued, speaking, but her words seemed to fade into the background as William and Kate focused on the scene before them. The resilience of children never failed to amaze them, but even the strongest spirits could be broken by too much hardship at once. The fire department has confirmed that everyone got out safely, Dr. Mitchell was saying, but the building is completely uninhabitable. These families have nowhere to go, and many of the children are too unwell to be moved far from the hospital. As they stood there, preparing to enter the room and meet with the families, William and Kate knew that this visit would be unlike any other they had made. This wasn't about ribbon cutting or ceremonial duties. This was about human compassion in the face of genuine crisis, and they both felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on their shoulders. William took a deep breath and gently pushed open the door to the makeshift accommodation room. The first thing that hit them was the smell, a mixture of smoke, antiseptic, and something else that Kate couldn't quite identify, but that made her stomach clench with sympathy. It was the smell of loss, of fear, of lives suddenly turned upside down. The families looked up as they entered, and Kate noticed how some of the children immediately tried to hide behind their parents. These weren't the usual excited faces they were used to seeing during hospital visits. These children had been through something that had shaken their trust in the world around them. A young mother named Emma approached them hesitantly. She was, probably in her early 30s, but the stress of the past night had aged her considerably. Her 8-year-old son, James, stood beside her, his hand firmly gripped in hers. The boy had been receiving treatment for leukemia, and his pale, thin frame made him appear even more fragile than usual. "Your Highnesses," Emma said quietly, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Thank you for coming. James here, he was so scared last night. He kept asking if the fire was going to reach his hospital room." Kate knelt down to James's eye level, her heart breaking at the fear still visible in his young face. "Hello, James," she said softly. "I heard you were very brave last night. Can you tell me about what happened?" James looked at his mother for reassurance before speaking. "The fire alarms were so loud," he whispered, "and there was smoke everywhere. Mummy carried me outside, but I couldn't breathe very well. I thought the hospital was going to burn down too, and then where would I get my medicine?" The innocent logic of a child facing incomprehensible circumstances nearly undid Kate's composure. She glanced up at William, who was listening intently while fighting his own emotional response. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she continued the story. "We lost everything," she said simply. "All of James's favorite books, his special blanket, the photo albums with pictures of his father who passed away 2 years ago. James has been asking about his daddy's pictures all morning." William placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "We're going to make sure you and James have everything you need," he said firmly. "No family should have to face this alone, especially not while dealing with medical treatment." As they moved through the room, each family's story seemed more heartbreaking than the last. There was Maria, a single mother from Spain whose 4-year-old daughter Sophia was recovering from heart surgery. Maria spoke broken English, but her distress was universal. She kept repeating, "Todo perdido, todo perdido." Everything lost, everything lost. Sophia sat quietly on her mother's lap, her surgical scar visible through her thin hospital gown. She stared at William and Kate with wide, solemn eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. When Kate offered her a gentle smile, Sophia buried her face in her mother's shoulder. The little girl with the damaged teddy bear that they had seen from outside was named Lily. She was 6 years old and had been receiving treatment for a rare neurological condition. Her grandmother, Margaret, explained that Lily's parents had died in a car accident the previous year, and she was the child's sole guardian. "That bear belonged to her mother," Margaret said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "It's the only thing Lily has left of her parents. And look at it now. Half burned, falling apart. She won't let anyone take it away to try to clean it." Kate sat down beside Lily on the makeshift bed. The little girl looked up at her with eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. "That's a very special bear," Kate said gently. "What's his name?" "Mr. Snuggles," Lily whispered. "Mummy gave him to me before she went to heaven. Now he's hurt too." The simple statement hit Kate like a physical blow. She had to take a moment to compose herself before responding. "Sometimes when things we love get hurt, they become even more precious to us," she said carefully. "Mr. Snuggles might look different now, but he's still full of all the love your mummy put into him." William was speaking with a teenage boy named Marcus, who was 15 and had been battling bone cancer for over a year. Marcus was trying to be strong, but his voice cracked as he described watching the flames from his hospital window. "I thought about all the kids in here who can't walk or run fast," Marcus said. "I kept thinking, what if the fire spread to the hospital? How would they get everyone out? Some of these little kids can barely move." The teenager's concern for others, despite his own trauma, spoke to the kind of courage that both William and Kate had seen repeatedly in young patients. It was humbling and inspiring, but also deeply saddening that children should have to display such bravery in the face of circumstances beyond their control. Dr. Mitchell quietly approached William and Kate as they continued moving through the room. "We've been trying to contact other accommodation facilities," she said in a low voice, "but everything is full. The hospital administration is working on solutions, but it's going to take time. Some of these families have been here for months already, and their children's treatments can't be interrupted." Kate watched as a young father tried to comfort his twin daughters, both of whom were receiving treatment for cystic fibrosis. The girls were about 7 years old, and they kept asking when they could go home to their room in the residential building. Their father's attempts to explain that their temporary home was gone seemed to confuse them more than comfort them. The psychological impact of the fire was becoming increasingly clear. These families were already coping with the stress of serious childhood illness, financial strain, and being away from their support networks. The fire had stripped away their sense of safety and stability, leaving them feeling completely vulnerable. An elderly man named Robert sat in a corner chair, holding his 5-year-old grandson, Tommy. The boy had been born with a severe heart defect and had undergone multiple surgeries. Robert explained that he and his wife had moved from Scotland to be near Tommy during his treatments, but his wife was currently too ill to travel and didn't even know about the fire yet. "I don't know how to tell her," Robert said quietly. "She's been so worried about Tommy, and now this. We're too old to start over again, but what choice do we have?" The accumulation of individual tragedies was overwhelming. Each family's story represented not just the immediate crisis of the fire, but the ongoing challenges of childhood illness, family separation, and financial hardship. William and Kate realized they were witnessing a convergence of human suffering that would require much more than temporary comfort to address. As William and Kate continued their rounds through the temporary accommodation area, they came upon a sight that would remain etched in their memories forever. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a medical screen, was a makeshift bed where a young couple sat with their infant daughter. The baby, who couldn't have been more than 6 months old, was connected to a portable oxygen tank. Her tiny chest rose and fell with obvious effort, and her parents, David and Sarah, looked like they hadn't slept in days even before the fire had occurred. Sarah looked up as William and Kate approached, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "She was born 3 months early," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been in the hospital for her entire life. Last night was the first time we'd ever taken her outside, even just to the residential building, and then this happened." David, who appeared to be in his early 20s, was gently stroking his daughter's tiny hand. "We named her Hope," he said with a bitter laugh. "Seemed appropriate at the time. Now I'm not sure what we were thinking." Kate felt her maternal instincts surge as she looked at the tiny infant. The baby's eyes were open, staring up at nothing, in particular. And Kate could see the same fighting spirit in that small face that she had witnessed in so many young patients over the years. "Hope is a beautiful name," Kate said softly. "And she's clearly a fighter, just like her parents." Sarah shook her head, tears beginning to flow again. "We lost all her special blankets in the fire, the ones that smelled like home. The nurses say smell is important for premature babies, that it helps them feel secure. Now everything smells like smoke and hospital disinfectant." The practical implications of the fire were becoming more apparent with each family's story. These weren't just material possessions that had been lost. They were the small comforts and familiar objects that helped children cope with the stress of serious illness and extended hospital stays. William noticed a commotion near the entrance to the room and saw Dr. Mitchell speaking urgently with a team of social workers. Their expressions were grave, and he could see them glancing toward some of the families with obvious concern. Dr. Mitchell approached William and Kate discreetly. "We have another problem developing," she said quietly. "Some of these families are here from other countries, seeking specialized treatment that isn't available in their home nations. Their visas and documentation were destroyed in the fire, and we're getting calls from immigration authorities asking about their status." The complexity of the situation was expanding beyond what anyone had initially realized. Not only were these families dealing with medical crises and the immediate trauma of the fire, but some were now facing the possibility of being forced to leave the country before their children's treatments were complete. Kate's attention was drawn to a young woman, sitting alone on one of the beds, holding a cell phone and speaking in what sounded like Arabic. The woman was crying as she spoke, and even without understanding the language, it was clear she was trying to explain a terrible situation to someone far away. Through a translator who had arrived with the social work team, William and Kate learned that the woman's name was Amira, and her 3-year-old son Omar was receiving treatment for a rare form of brain cancer. Her husband was back in Syria, unable to travel due to the ongoing conflict there, and she had been alone in London for 6 months. "She's trying to explain to her husband what happened," the translator said. "He's been selling everything he owns to pay for their son's treatment, and now she has to tell him that Omar's medications and medical supplies were destroyed in the fire." Omar himself was sleeping fitfully on the bed beside his mother, his head bandaged from a recent surgery. Even in sleep, his small face showed signs of pain and exhaustion. Amira stroked his forehead gently while continuing her heartbreaking phone conversation. The international dimension of the crisis added another layer of complexity that William and Kate hadn't initially considered. These families had often sacrificed everything to bring their children to London for treatment, and the fire had destroyed not just their temporary homes, but their lifelines to families and support systems thousands of miles away. As they moved through the room, William and Kate began to see patterns in the stories they were hearing. Many of the families had been living in the residential building for months, creating a small community of people united by the common experience of childhood illness. Children had made friends, parents had formed support networks, and everyone had established routines that helped them cope with their circumstances. The fire hadn't just destroyed a building. It had shattered an entire community of vulnerable people who had come to depend on each other for emotional survival. A nurse approached them with a clipboard, her face showing the strain of trying to manage an impossible situation. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said quietly, "we need to start moving some of these families to different areas of the hospital for the night, but many of the children are refusing to be separated from each other. They're scared that if they can't see their friends, something bad will happen to them too." The psychological trauma was manifesting in ways that the medical staff was struggling to address. Children who had already learned to cope with serious illness were now facing a new fear, the fear that safety was an illusion and that disaster could strike without warning. William watched as a group of children who had been separated during the evacuation were finally reunited. The relief on their faces was palpable, but so was the underlying anxiety that still gripped them. They stayed close together, unwilling to let each other out of sight. Dr. Mitchell pulled William and Kate aside for a private conversation. "The building was a total loss," she said bluntly. "The investigation will take weeks, but early reports suggest it was an electrical fire that spread very quickly. The families were lucky to get out alive, but now we're looking at a long-term accommodation crisis," she continued. "These aren't families who can just go to a hotel for a few nights. Their children need to be within walking distance of the hospital for daily treatments, emergency care, and constant monitoring. The residential building was specifically designed for families of pediatric patients, and there's nothing else like it in London." The magnitude of the problem was becoming clear. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience that could be solved with a few nights of alternative accommodation. This was a complete disruption of the support system that dozens of seriously ill children depended on for their survival and recovery. Kate looked around the room at the faces of parents who were trying to stay strong for their children while dealing with their own overwhelming fears and uncertainties. These were people who had already shown incredible courage by uprooting their lives to seek medical care for their children, and now they were facing a crisis that threatened to undermine everything they had sacrificed for. The afternoon wore on as William and Kate continued meeting with families, and the emotional toll was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Each story seemed to reveal another layer of tragedy, another complication that made the situation more desperate than they had initially understood. They were introduced to the Chen family, who had traveled from Hong Kong when their 8-year-old daughter May was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia that required a specific treatment protocol, only available in London. Mr. Chen spoke limited English, but his wife Linda translated as he described their situation. "He says we spent our life savings to come here," Linda explained, her voice shaking. "We sold our apartment, left our jobs, everything. The treatment was supposed to take 6 months, but May has had complications. We've been here for over a year now." May sat quietly beside her parents, wearing a bright yellow headscarf that contrasted sharply with her pale complexion. She had been drawing in a coloring book that appeared to be slightly singed around the edges, one of the few possessions she had managed to grab during the evacuation. "I draw pictures for the other children," May said in careful English, showing Kate her artwork, "to make them happy when they are scared." The drawing showed a group of children holding hands under a rainbow, with a large building in the background that Kate realized must be the hospital. Even in the midst of her own crisis, this young girl was trying to bring comfort to others. Linda continued explaining their situation. "The residential building felt like home to us. May made friends there, and we had a small kitchen where I could cook familiar foods for her. Now," she gestured helplessly at their surroundings. Mr. Chen spoke urgently to his wife in Cantonese, and Linda's expression grew even more worried. "He's concerned about the insurance," she translated. "We had travel insurance, but it doesn't cover this type of situation, and May's treatment isn't complete yet. We can't go back to Hong Kong, but we don't know how we can afford to stay." William made a mental note to discuss the insurance complications with Dr. Mitchell later. He was beginning to realize that the fire had created a complex web of problems that went far beyond immediate accommodation needs. They were then approached by a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Patricia, a volunteer coordinator, who had been helping families navigate the London healthcare system. She looked exhausted and overwhelmed. "Your Highnesses," Patricia said, "I've been working with these families for months, helping them with everything from grocery shopping to understanding medical terminology. The residential building wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a support community. Parents helped each other with childcare during medical appointments, shared meals, translated for families who didn't speak English well." She gestured toward a group of children playing quietly in one corner. "These kids have formed bonds that are helping them cope with their illnesses. They understand each other in ways that healthy children can't. The fire didn't just destroy a building. It destroyed a carefully constructed support system." Kate watched the children Patricia had indicated. Despite everything they had been through, they were still trying to play and find moments of normalcy. However, their games were different from what she might expect from healthy children. They were gentler, more careful with each other, aware of medical limitations and the fragility of their situations. One boy, about 10 years old, was carefully helping a younger girl who was connected to a portable IV drip. He held the tubing out of her way as she tried to color in a book, showing the kind of mature caretaking behavior that childhood illness often forces on young patients. Dr. Mitchell returned with more concerning news. "We've just heard from the city planning office," she said quietly to William and Kate. "The residential building cannot be rebuilt on the same site due to new fire safety regulations. The insurance investigation could take months, and even then, we're looking at years before any replacement facility could be constructed." The long-term implications hit William and Kate simultaneously. These families were facing not just temporary displacement, but the complete loss of the specialized accommodation that made their children's treatment possible. A social worker named Janet joined their conversation. "We're already seeing families making impossible decisions," she said. "Some are talking about interrupting their children's treatment and returning to their home countries, even though it could be life-threatening. Others are trying to find rental accommodations in London, but the costs are beyond what most of these families can afford." Kate thought about her own children, safe at home with their nannies and security teams, never having to worry about where they would sleep or whether their medical needs would be met. The contrast felt almost unbearable. They were interrupted by a disturbance near the entrance to the room. A man in his 30s was arguing with a hospital administrator, his voice rising with frustration and desperation. "You don't understand," the man was saying. "My son needs his treatment tomorrow morning. If we have to leave the hospital grounds, how do I get him here at 6 a.m. without a car? We lost our car keys in the fire, along with everything else." The administrator was trying to explain temporary transportation arrangements, but it was clear that the logistics were becoming overwhelming for everyone involved. Dr. Mitchell sighed deeply. "That's Paul Stevens," she explained to William and Kate. "His son Danny has cystic fibrosis and requires daily respiratory treatments that must be done here at the hospital. Paul and his wife Julie have been living in the residential building for 4 months, while Danny undergoes an experimental treatment program." The practical complications were multiplying by the hour. These families needed to be close to the hospital not just for convenience, but for medical necessity. Many of the children required emergency care that could only be provided within minutes, not the hours it might take to travel from distant accommodations. William was beginning to formulate ideas about how they might help address some of these immediate concerns, but he was also realizing that this crisis would require sustained effort and significant resources to resolve properly. A young nurse approached them with another update. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said, "we've just received word that several news outlets have gotten word about the fire. They're asking for interviews with some of the families." Kate and William exchanged a concerned look. Media attention could be helpful in raising awareness and generating support for the families, but it could also add stress and invasion of privacy at a time when these people were at their most vulnerable. Dr. Mitchell looked worried about this development as well. "Many of these families are here seeking confidential medical treatment," she said. "Some have specifically requested privacy due to the sensitive nature of their children's conditions. Media attention could compromise their ability to receive care without unwanted scrutiny. The complexity of managing a crisis involving vulnerable children, international families, and specialized medical care was becoming more apparent by the minute. Every potential solution seemed to create new challenges that no one had anticipated." As evening approached, William and Kate found themselves in Dr. Mitchell's office, trying to process everything they had witnessed throughout the day. The sight of so many vulnerable families in crisis had shaken them both more deeply than they had expected. "I need to ask you both something difficult," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "We're going to have to start discharging some of these families tomorrow, even though we have nowhere appropriate to send them. The hospital simply cannot continue to house dozens of additional people indefinitely." Kate felt her stomach drop. "What does that mean for the children's treatments?" "Some treatments will have to be postponed or modified," Dr. Mitchell admitted. "Others might have to be discontinued entirely if families can't maintain proximity to the hospital. We're looking at potential treatment interruptions for children who are in critical phases of their care." The medical implications were staggering. Children who had been making progress in their treatment could face setbacks or even life-threatening complications if their care was disrupted. William had been unusually quiet during this conversation, but now he looked up with determination. "That's not acceptable," he said firmly. "These children's lives cannot be put at risk because of an accommodation crisis. What would it take to keep them here?" Dr. Mitchell pulled out a thick folder of documents. "We would need emergency authorization from the health authority to convert several hospital areas into temporary family accommodation. We would need funding for additional staff, security, food services, and basic amenities. Most importantly, we would need assurance that this arrangement could continue for months, possibly years." Kate was struck by a realization. "This isn't just about these specific families, is it? If the residential building can't be rebuilt quickly, this affects every family who might need specialized pediatric care in London in the future." "Exactly," Dr. Mitchell confirmed. "We're looking at a systemic breakdown of support services for families of seriously ill children. The residential building served families from across Europe, Africa, and Asia who came here for treatments not available in their home countries." The international implications were sobering. London's position as a center for pediatric specialty care meant that the loss of family accommodation could affect children's health outcomes on a global scale. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. A young woman entered, introducing herself as Rebecca Williams, a representative from the hospital's child psychology team. "I need to brief you on what we're seeing from a mental health perspective," Rebecca said without preamble. "The children are showing signs of complex trauma that goes beyond the immediate fire incident. Many of them were already dealing with medical PTSD from their illnesses and treatments. The fire has compounded this significantly." She opened a notebook filled with observations from throughout the day. "We're seeing regressive behaviors in younger children, panic attacks in teenagers, and concerning levels of depression and anxiety. Across all age groups, several children have expressed feeling that they are cursed or that bad things keep happening to them because they deserve it." Kate's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the psychological assessment. The idea that children might blame themselves for circumstances completely beyond their control was heartbreaking. Rebecca continued, "What's particularly concerning is that the fire has shattered these children's sense of safety, just as they were beginning to adapt to their medical circumstances. Many had found ways to cope with their illnesses by creating routines and finding comfort in familiar surroundings. The fire has destroyed those coping mechanisms." William asked the question that was weighing on all their minds. "What kind of long-term impact are we looking at?" Without proper intervention and stable housing solutions, we could see lasting psychological effects that interfere with medical treatment adherence, family relationships, and long-term development. Rebecca said bluntly, "These children need consistency and safety to heal, both physically and emotionally." Dr. Mitchell's phone rang, and her expression grew even more grave as she listened to the caller. When she hung up, she turned to the group with news that made the situation even more urgent. "That was the fire investigation team," she said. "They've determined that the electrical system in the residential building had been compromised for weeks before the fire actually occurred. There were warning signs that were apparently missed or ignored by the building maintenance company." The implication was clear. This tragedy might have been preventable, which added another layer of anger and frustration to an already devastating situation. Kate stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the hospital grounds. In the distance, she could see the blackened remains of the residential building, still cordoned off by fire department barriers. Smoke was no longer rising from the structure, but the sight of the destruction was a stark reminder of how quickly lives could be turned upside down. "William," she said quietly, "we can't just visit and leave. These families need more than sympathy." William joined her at the window. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. This requires immediate action and long-term commitment." Dr. Mitchell and Rebecca exchanged glances. They had hosted many royal visits over the years, but they had never seen this level of personal engagement and determination from any official visitors. "If you're serious about wanting to help," Dr. Mitchell said carefully, "there are several levels of intervention that could make a difference. Immediate, medium-term, and long-term solutions that could address different aspects of this crisis." William turned from the window with an expression that both women recognized as the moment when sympathy transformed into action. "Tell us what's needed," he said simply. Dr. Mitchell pulled out another set of documents. "Immediately, we need emergency funding to keep these families housed within the hospital while we develop alternatives. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds just for the next few months." Kate was already mentally calculating the resources that could be mobilized through their various charitable foundations and connections. "Medium term, we need temporary accommodation that meets the specific needs of families with seriously ill children. This isn't just about housing. It's about creating a therapeutic environment that supports medical treatment and family well-being." William was taking notes now, his mind clearly working through the logistics and possibilities. "Long-term, we need to completely reimagine how we provide support for families facing extended pediatric medical treatment. The old model of a single residential building has proven vulnerable. We need something more resilient and comprehensive." Rebecca added her own perspective. "And throughout all of this, we need psychological support services that acknowledge the complex trauma these families have experienced. Traditional therapy approaches may not be sufficient for children dealing with both life-threatening illness and sudden disaster." As the meeting continued into the evening, William and Kate began to understand that they were witnessing more than just a tragic accident. They were seeing the intersection of healthcare policy, social services, international relations, and human resilience in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about effective charitable work. The families sleeping in makeshift beds just down the hall weren't just statistics or case studies. They were real people facing impossible choices, and the decisions made in the coming days would literally determine whether some children lived or died. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating first visit to the hospital, and William and Kate returned to see the progress that had been made. The sight that greeted them was dramatically different from the desperate scene they had encountered before, but it was also more emotionally complex than they had anticipated. The large conference room had been transformed into a comfortable living area with proper beds, colorful decorations, and designated spaces for different activities. Children were playing games, reading books, and engaging in art therapy sessions. Parents were sitting together in small groups, sharing meals and conversations that suggested the beginning of healing. But as William and Kate moved through the space, they could see that the trauma of the fire still lingered in subtle ways. Children stayed closer to their parents than usual, and many families had positioned themselves near emergency exits. The sounds of laughter were more precious because they were less frequent than they should have been. Lily, the 6-year-old, with the damaged teddy bear, approached Kate with a shy smile. Mr. Snuggles had been carefully cleaned and mended by a team of volunteer seamstresses, though he still bore the scars of his ordeal. More importantly, Lily herself seemed more engaged and responsive than she had been during their first meeting. "Look," Lily said, holding up a drawing. "I made this for you." The picture showed 2 women with crowns standing next to a hospital, surrounded by children holding hands. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for helping us." Kate felt tears spring to her eyes as she accepted the drawing. The simple gesture represented so much more than artistic expression. It showed that Lily was beginning to believe in safety and kindness again. William was speaking with Marcus, the teenage cancer patient who had shown such maturity during the crisis. Marcus looked healthier than he had 3 weeks ago, and his demeanor was more optimistic. "The new setup is actually better in some ways," Marcus was explaining. "Before, we were isolated in separate apartments. Now we're all together, and it feels more like a community. The little kids aren't as scared because there are always people around." The observation was astute and revealed an unexpected positive outcome of the temporary arrangements. The crisis had forced the creation of a more integrated support system that was benefiting everyone involved. Dr. Mitchell approached them with an update on the medical outcomes. "We haven't had to interrupt any treatments," she reported with obvious relief. "In fact, some children are showing better treatment adherence because they feel more secure and supported." The medical success was gratifying, but William and Kate both knew that the current arrangements were still temporary solutions to a complex long-term problem. Emma, the mother of 8-year-old James, joined their conversation. She looked significantly better than she had during the immediate aftermath of the fire, but there was still an underlying tension in her demeanor. "James is doing well with his treatment," Emma said, "but he still has nightmares about fires. Last week, when there was a small kitchen fire in the hospital cafeteria, just burnt toast, really, he had a panic attack that lasted for hours. The lingering psychological effects were a reminder that healing from trauma takes much longer than addressing immediate physical needs. Even with improved circumstances, the families were still carrying the emotional weight of their experiences." Kate spent time with baby Hope and her parents, David and Sarah. The infant had grown noticeably in the 3 weeks since the fire, and her parents seemed more confident in their ability to care for her. "The hardest part now is not knowing what comes next," Sarah admitted. "This arrangement can't last forever, and we still don't know where we'll be living when Hope is finally strong enough to leave the hospital." The uncertainty about long-term housing remained one of the most stressful aspects of the situation for all the families. While immediate needs were being met, the lack of permanent solutions created ongoing anxiety. William had been working behind the scenes with government, officials, healthcare administrators, and charitable organizations to develop sustainable solutions. The complexity of the challenge had become even more apparent as they delved deeper into the systemic issues. "We've identified a property that could serve as a replacement residential facility," William explained to Dr. Mitchell during a private meeting. "But the renovation and adaptation work will take at least 18 months, and the regulatory approvals could take even longer." The timeline was sobering. Even with unlimited resources and political will, creating appropriate accommodation for families of seriously ill children was a complex undertaking that couldn't be rushed. Kate had been particularly focused on the psychological support services, working with child psychologists to develop specialized programs for children dealing with both medical trauma and disaster-related PTSD. "We're seeing some remarkable resilience," reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, a trauma specialist who had been brought in to work with the families. Children are incredibly adaptable, but they need consistent support and clear communication about their circumstances. The psychological interventions were showing positive results, but they also revealed the depth of the emotional work that would be required for full recovery. As the day progressed, William and Kate participated in various activities with the families. They helped serve lunch, joined in art therapy sessions, and read stories to younger children. The interactions felt more natural and less formal than typical royal visits, reflecting the genuine relationships that had developed over the past 3 weeks. During one particularly poignant moment, they witnessed a reunion between Amira and her son Omar with Omar's father, who had finally been able to travel from Syria to London. The family's joy at being reunited was overwhelming, but it also highlighted the sacrifices and separations that many families had endured in their quest for medical care. The international dimension of the crisis had prompted discussions about improving support systems for families who travel across borders for specialized medical treatment. William and Kate were learning that the fire had exposed gaps in healthcare policy that affected vulnerable populations worldwide. As evening approached, they gathered with all the families for a community dinner. The atmosphere was warm and hopeful, but also tinged with the awareness that this particular chapter of their shared experience was temporary. Little Mei Chen stood up with her parents' encouragement and addressed the group in her careful English. "I want to say thank you to everyone who helped us when we were scared," she said. "Now we help each other, and that makes us strong." The simple statement captured something profound about how the families had transformed their shared trauma into a source of mutual support and resilience. Later that evening, as William and Kate prepared to leave the hospital, they stood once again at the window overlooking the grounds. The charred remains of the residential building were still visible in the distance, but they no longer dominated the view. Instead, their attention was drawn to the warm lights glowing from the temporary accommodation areas where families were settling in for another night of safety and community. "This isn't the end of their story," Kate said quietly. "It's just the beginning of a different chapter." William nodded, understanding that their involvement with these families would continue long after the immediate crisis had passed. They had witnessed something that had changed their understanding of resilience, community, and the complex relationship between healthcare and social support. The sight that had initially stopped their hearts had evolved into something more complex. A testament to human courage, the power of community support, and the ongoing challenge of caring for society's most vulnerable members. The tears they had fought back during their first visit had been replaced by a deeper commitment to systemic change and long-term advocacy. As they walked through the hospital corridors one final time that day, they could hear the quiet sounds of families settling in for the night, parents reading bedtime stories, children whispering to each other across beds, and the gentle hum of medical equipment that represented hope for healing and recovery. The crisis had revealed both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit, and William and Kate knew they had been forever changed by witnessing both.